Greetings. Greetings to you tuning in here live or in recording in the times to come. I am Ian MacKenzie. I am the host, I suppose, of The Crow's Nest, which is really finding its own exploratory way. And, this is on the one hand, an inspiration and an outgrowth from the School of Mythopoetics, which we'll talk about in a moment, as well as, I think, an attempt to create a moment or a platform to speak about the moments of the day, like big themes, big topics of the day, but from a mythopoetic lens. And the first episode actually I had last week was with Sophie Strand, an incredible author, mythologist, poet. And today I am delighted to be joined by journalist, storyteller, Papa, Michael Newman. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Greetings. Thank you for having me, Ian. In gratitude for the series of cause and effect in creation that brings us to this moment. It seems like it's been an interesting kind of swarming of both of our worlds, but I feel like there's some beautiful synergy in the work that you do and the work that I do, and just admiring your emergence as these different iterations of your work have transpired. So, for having me.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, well, I'd love for us, as we jump in, to first hear, or to maybe connect it to how we first connected. And as I recall, it was over a year or so ago now, at the very first A Gathering of Stories event, which I actually held. It was live in Victoria, British Columbia. And you work for the local media there. And I believe you'd reached out. You said, hey, this is really interesting. I'm curious, what you're on about. And yeah, we did an interview, and I believe it aired on the local TV there. And since then, you've wandered your way into the former incarnation of the school, which was School, the Mythic Masculine Network, and there's something, of course, that you felt affinity to, a kinship with, this way of the mythopoetic. And so I'd love for you to share just a little about, what is it in this recognition or understanding of seeing the world through the mythopoetic in your own story. How have those things really come alive for you?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ian. When I think about it, like, my worlds have been kind of like parallels, but like never really intersecting, of like the work that I do outwardly as a media creator, as an interviewer, as a dialogue conversationalist, and like the inner work of like my own kind of inner spiritual journey. And I do it in my own home, whatever. But really being inspired by a lot of Carl Jung's work and Joseph Campbell and all the like. And I never really had story as an idea in my upbringing. My family's from the Caribbean, and I grew up in Florida, and long history there, but found myself in British Columbia now. But the idea of story being like the world itself being a mirror back to us, and it's not really the thing itself. Jung used to say, when you think it's the thing, it's not actually the thing. It's like these archetypical thought forms and these beings, these things that are swarming around us, that are reflecting back to us our own lived experience, that we can grow and evolve, right? So that's kind of the context of the cosmology that I'm operating in now. So you doing that work with the Mythic Masculine, like, I was like, it kind of stumbled across it as I was doing my own kind of inner Jungian work and finding Jungian podcasts and something along masculine and that kind of thing. And then seeing the school was like, oh, cool. This is something that's really interesting, that is interfacing story and big story, which I'm kind of really grappled with in the work that I do, and really make sense making. And I really joined, and I wanted to cover that event. I was like, this is a cool intersection of having a live event. We're bringing people to talk about story in a time where there's so much dismay and unraveling, and having a collective sense making kind of an initiative like the Gathering of Stories was a kind of a great conduit for that. So I wanted to bring that into the workspace, which I don't think normally we get play in the normal media world, but I find it like my particular being and my skill set and my consciousness being attuned to so many different things, that I can maybe be a gatekeeper and bring things in that might switch things up. So I was grateful to be able to share that with an audience that maybe wouldn't have come into contact with it. So since then, it's just been more of like wanting to be engaged in similar dialogues around the deeper substrata of phenomena, and how do we, as individual souls, as beings, as humans, collectively do something with that helps generate more emergence and evolution. So that's kind of the context that from that question.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. It strikes me that we just through Signal chats, in the meantime too. Yeah, we've had some really great dialogues. I felt, and so I'm grateful that we can now have one here.
Yeah.
And one of the things that came up, which I'd love to share a bit here, was just recognizing, in some ways, like the function of media, or at least mainstream media, as a way of manufacturing perspective, perhaps, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But also the limitations of complexity, right?
Yeah.
Within the very form of mainstream media, it seems there's a paradox there, because it needs to reduce complexity in order to be, I don't know, palpable, or fit
Hmm.
within a certain paradigm. But the world isn't so black and white, obviously. Yeah, and so I'd be curious to hear from your side, as one who works in the media.
Hmm.
What did you see, or what have you recognized now of this limitation, and what the what's lost when we are unable to create nuanced perspectives in the public consciousness, in public dialogue.
Yeah, such a tricky thing because it's not a one-step solution because it requires an engagement from the participant's perspective of wanting to engage with complex ideas that don't have
Mm-hmm.
simplified, and our brains are naturally wired to want to have like order and understanding and control and sense making, right? But then at the same time, we have the media producing content daily, looking for content and trying to present content to an audience with a work a business model that requires like nonstop engagement, right? So it's like this impossible Rubik's cube of wanting to engage, but also how to engage, but how do you tell really complex stories that would require months long investigations because everything is interrelated, but at the same time we have to put something for a nightly newscast, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
how do you do that?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's not to place blame anywhere, but it's to we haven't really, like with anything, when we become more conscious to what we're doing and how we're doing it, we start to realize, oh wait, there might be some inconsistencies here, or there might be some nuance that we might miss. And I think we're starting to get to those dialogues now as we talk about diversity and inclusion, and whose story are we centering. And so, yeah, there is a gap of when you're talking about any kind of complex issues, which a lot of these complex ecological, technological, financial issues aren't one size fits all. They're like
Mm-hmm.
multifaceted. And so, how do we engage? How do we tell stories that doesn't minimize the observer as just a passive consumer, but actually actively engages them in understanding their own kind of piece of this bigger puzzle?
Mm-hmm.
And also what is the role as the gatekeepers, as people who are presenting information, to realize that we're curating it, right? Like there's a curation part of this process that we, in our own individual subjective experience, we receive information, or we see what is newsworthy and what is not newsworthy, and we only have so much time to fill. And how do we
Yeah.
choose that, and how do we present that to people so that people don't think that it's just this one thing, it's complex.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of, again, I don't have an answer to that, but that's that question that I'm asking myself as a person who's introspective and like has a philosophy and this depth and this understanding, and the conversations we've had around, is there a limit to an objective narrative in a world that is so subjectively fractured? And I want to bring up something that you mentioned, and even in one of the last, I think, the pandemic is a prism, this idea of this prism, like if truth is a prism, like not even just a pandemic, like general truth is a prism, it's not one unified like monolith.
Mm-hmm.
Do we require different types of dialogue and coming together to have multiple facets being illuminated so that we can come to a better sense making? So
Yeah.
those are questions I'm
Mm.
kind of meandering around and seeing.
Yeah.
Even this conversation is generating more stuff for me now. So, but yeah, so I
Mm.
hope that answers the question without rambling too much.
Yeah. No, beautiful, Michael. It makes me think too that the how to say it. It's like it's easy to judge mainstream media too and say, they're liars, or they're lying, or they're But again, it's like there's a certain inbound bias, for obviously like a number of factors,
Mm.
because also I think the audience, or people in general, there's a real overload, obviously, of information, and it's very known that most people like skim on the internet, or skim headlines, and often look for confirmation bias, right? And so it's
Mhm.
like, oh, there's a headline that affirms my existing view of reality. So, oh, clearly that's, what the objective truth is, because it's what I already think, so I like to be affirmed in that. And how many people actively seek to be challenged, right, in their paradigm,
Mm-hmm.
especially when we're often on this treadmill, right, of just trying to get through the day and get everything done. So there's a deeply, yeah, there's challenges there. The other thing
Mm-hmm.
that I want to bring up too is I recently watched the Willow trailer for the new
Mm.
series. I don't know if you've seen it yet.
No, not yet.
Okay, so here's my '80s kid outing himself, but uh, I was intrigued. Right? They just I think it's Apple. No, is it Lucasfilm is doing it? But I think it's either on
Apple
Apple.
TV.
It might be Apple
Mm-hmm.
actually. Yeah, but they're doing a Willow series, so it's like I don't know, maybe a number of episodes, not just a movie. And it's got Warwick Davis, the original Willow, and I was curious if Val Kilmer's going to show up anywhere. But in the trailer, it's really interesting, right? The dialogue is very much something like in a time when evil rises, right? Like something like that, right? Like there's a balance, and when like evil grows, like so must the good, or I don't know. There's some basically a very dualistic
Mm-hmm.
good versus evil paradigm, which is again is very unchallenged often, right? And I ended up writing an essay after the second new Star Wars came out. I think it was maybe The Last Jedi or something. I can't remember what it's called
Mm-hmm.
now. But that was a really interesting film because it showed a complexity with Luke and showed him as really like a complex hero in that film.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, what I want to say is that the paradigm, and this is something, again, wonder about it, and many have wondered about it. It's just for me, it feels really important now, especially because in the school, we're currently in the solar theme of Gemini and the
Mm-hmm.
archetype of the trickster, right? So here we go. Archetype of the trickster is that the good evil paradigm as a very clear delineation, I believe, is an adolescent understanding of the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? The need to have a clean who's the bad guy, who's the good guy. It's an adolescent understanding because it really requires a collapsing of nuance, right? Of multiplicity of like the ability to see that, oh wait, there isn't one side to anything really, on one side or the
Mm-hmm.
other. That doesn't mean there isn't the need to rise when evil, let's say in quotations, arises, right? That there isn't a need to actually be able to discern with some degree of wisdom. That's not what I'm saying either, because oftentimes that is the case, right? To
Mm-hmm.
clearly discern action, right action or non-action, or to rise against aggression, right, in different forms. That's all true. But what I want to say is the media, I think, has a similar challenge of trying to, reduce complexity into, who's the bad guy or not. And I just want to bring up the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial, right?
Mm-hmm.
As again, like, so we're kind of seeing a moment in the, collective consciousness play out within a paradigm that is trying to, I guess, assert
Mm-hmm.
who's wrong and who's right, right? And of course, the legal system, this is what it does. It has to, affirm who's right and who's wrong to be able to assign guilt, or vindication or whatever it is. So I'm curious again, as you, researched it. I asked you before this too to take a peek, but what did you see? Just again, how this played out within that paradigm of good,
Mm-hmm.
evil, right, wrong, and even in social media too, right? So whose side, Team Johnny, Team Amber, whatever it was, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. Like I feel like all these manifestations of in common culture exist within a binary, right? Like, and that is kind of like a more the polarity of things we talk about. We don't want things to become more polarized, but the things that we're creating to articulate or to express our realities are stuck in a binary box. You talk about
Mm.
Twitter. You either have a like or or you comment about why you don't like it. It's never like I'm interested. Like, can me more? I'm curious about this. Can you give me like? You don't see those comments, right? Or the way that the digital interface is the platforms aren't one of like engagement from a fruitful place. Like, how do we make this generative? I think, and I feel like we're in this phase of our own evolution as a, as a collective in the Western mind, at least, that we're starting to, start to evolve our thinking. If things are three dimensional, and I think about indigenous understanding and like that trickster, you know, you're looking at one face, but it has another face in the back, but at the same time, they are the same being, right? Like, what does
Yeah.
that mean? Like, if you try to isolate and control and say this is one thing and this is another thing, so that's the context I see it in of like we're starting to think about things in a more dimensional way. And you talk about physics, like how many the Newtonian model is evolving into this multidimensional you know weird stuff. Like it's happening at every level of society of how we think about the world, and the same thing applies, I think, to culture and society as we're all evolving, right? So that's kind of where I look at it. And then with this, the Johnny Depp and the Amber Heard thing, it's like, one, we're curating that these two individuals are the pinnacle of what the world needs to think and know about. And one on one side of it, I would say it's like, yeah, it's an interesting story. Like it evokes something in us, and I think on a deeper level, like a deeper subconscious level. And I spoke about this in the school about the Will Smith slap to Chris Rock. Like from like a benign objective perspective, like, yeah, cool, two celebrities slapping each other, whatever. But the spectacle of it, because of how we propose these individual humans on this grandiose scale as being Hollywood stars or in the public purview, and what that means, quote unquote, to us individuals who are living our days day to day. I think that automatically puts it in another context, right? Mythically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the female male dynamics is a whole nother thing of like, we're in this space of normalized, violence and trying to figure out who's the victor, who's the victim, and that drama triangle, if folks are familiar with that in psychology. How do we start to identify and break out of that drama triangle? And a lot of it is coming from healing and doing that inner work, which in the culture is not necessarily normalized. It's starting to become more in vogue with mental health and those kind of things. But it's those kind of frameworks of psychology and understanding ourselves that we start to identify how we're expressing and articulating that inner violence that we haven't really been able to process for generations. So that's one little piece of it. We're going to jump in with something else.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to name, I think it's helpful to view the lens of celebrity culture as actually, in some ways, a transposed longing for relationship to the gods.
Yeah.
Right. To larger than life characters where, the pantheon of intact cultures, or even, I'm thinking, ancient Greece, or all these cultures where, there was all this great dramas that were played out by these mythic figures. And yet there was a kind of commonality to those, to the relationality, like as in, the culture knew the stories together.
Yeah.
Right. And they would play out different rituals, and there would be this relationship, obviously, between this archetypal realm and the human realm. And I think in a culture where this, mythic layer has been essentially collapsed or dissolved, that and of course transposed onto, for example, celebrity culture, that there's this there's a shared in group happening with folks that are watching the spectacle, right? Because it's kind of like, hey, did you hear that, or did you hear about, like any sort of shared story or shared news, there's a certain kinship that can be established because we both know we have a relationship to actors in a way, again, that's in some ways artificial because it's at a distance, and yet also familiar, right? Because celebrity culture seems to seduce with that. And so to see these great titans in a way, see who's right and who's wrong, is fascinating to play out on the one hand. But of course, I was reading a post from the Me Too movement, right, recently, which you've read now as well, which I just issued the statement upon. Of course, the trial now has been voted, or at least found in favor of Johnny Depp. Amber, I'm reading here, has she has to basically award him $15 million in damages, and wild. I mean, I don't know what the paycheck was from Aquaman, but who knows? But Depp is actually, though, also has to pay her $2 million because there was some other defamation. I think his lawyer said something. So a little bit kind of her way, but certainly more towards Johnny. And a lot of the commentary is, some of it is around this idea, okay, Me Too is over. The great tidal wave of sea change, which I think to understand Me Too from a mythic lens, this is something that I've touched on here in different episodes of the podcast. But for me, what I saw it was like a great collective no from one could say the feminine, right, to the masculine, right? And if we think of patriarchy as the sort of masculine paradigm, which again is nuanced, and people who know my podcast, I go into it a lot. But if we just see it that way, it was this a sort of collective no more against a paradigm, which I would also call a dominator paradigm, right? Which or even a consumptive paradigm, which is when you look at somebody like Harvey Weinstein, he was this archetype of this older, male, almost tyrant king in a way.
Devouring.
Yeah, exactly. It was devouring this sort of young feminine, right? And so that collective sea change, captured by this whole movement, now people are saying in some ways, oh, it's over because in this case, here's a loss for I guess women as
Mhm.
seen as maybe primarily victims, I suppose. But the danger, of course, is that this personal story, of which seems like it was quite chaotic from both sides.
Mhm. Mhm.
Whatever the verdict says now in the courtroom, but it seems like it was quite a chaotic relationship, and that somehow this supplants the deeper recognition of a sea change in culture. Of course, that's the danger, right? To say, okay,
Mhm.
now this proves that Me Too's over, and there's consequence to that. But I think that's missing, that there was a much bigger personal element, certainly for all of the people that were able to speak out and find their voice and to say, yeah, me too. I've been hurt, largely women.
Mhm.
But again, the idea that because in this case a woman was found to have abused a man doesn't invalidate the overwhelming evidence that in a
Mhm.
dominator paradigm, it is women that are mostly subjected to, I guess, interpersonal relational violence.
Yeah, it's in the linear game. If you're going to context it in that way, it's like loss or win. But at the same time, it's like, no, like if the whole idea of the Me Too movement is to create a safe space to engage with a deep systemic issue, to out what I see, and you see this a lot of times in popular culture, is us outsourcing our agency to a particular phenomena, right? And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
because of that, all of this doesn't make sense, or this is a loss for the whole thing. And I mean, and granted, I want to be really empathetic to people who have been in a situation of a power differentiation, um, trauma dynamic. Like that's not to be mocked at all. But it's, I think when you talk about in society and the collective, when we look at stories like Amber Heard and the Johnny Depp thing, it's like that has a nuanced, um, there's some toxicity in that nuance of their relationship that needs to be identified also. Like,
Mm-hmm.
compare that to a normal, an average person, individual who is in a situation that's toxic. Like, there's complexity to each one of those things, and so not to see one isolated and say we're going to put this on the headline and that's going to be the story for the collective, and instead like really start to take agency in our own individual subjective experiences and start to have a real dialogue with that. I think what the Me Too movement has been seen as is like this wall of resistance against the man. But when you have that binary, you're automatically, there's a lever that can be pulled and pushed. But when
Mm-hmm.
it's like the mycelium, when you get into the soil of it, and you start to have individuals, and when you have organizations, and you have individuals and families talking about their trauma, talking about violence, then we can actually change the terrain. And I love what Sophie said last time, like adding more positive, um, you know, uh,
Mm.
what
Yeah.
is it? Yeah, the
So
soil
like,
gets more positive stuff to make a different culture, as opposed to
yeah.
just saying this is the problem, we're going to root it out. There's a different approach to it, which is, I guess, in a colonial mindset, it's like we're going to seek it and destroy, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to investigate and try to replace with beneficial bacteria. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. What comes to mind as well is, I mean, I think this, we have been sort of circling pop culture here as well, which again can be very fruitful as a mirror, of course, for so much of these discussions. Um, one of the things that comes to mind is uh, one is the Manosphere. If you've ever tracked any of that stuff, yeah, there's something called the Century 21 or Century 21. Basically, they have this whole thing called the Patriarch Convention, right, which happens once a year.
No.
It's pretty wild. You should, if you're curious at all, go check it out. But the Patriarch Convention, they even have a sort of side convention called Make Women Great Again. So, again, you can bet the kind of frame they have there. But I've been tracking it for a little while, just tuning in and being like, what is this on about? And, getting the newsletter from the sort of main sort of fellow who's like the first president of the Manosphere, he calls himself. And it's really fascinating, though, because at least the paradigm that he's operating in, and this group seems, is this idea that one, feminism has been inherently negative for men. In
Mm-hmm.
this case, I would call, or they would say, a patriarchal role of men as the sort of main decision maker, main alpha, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a battle going on, according to them, right, between all of the feminist agenda, let's say, that is trying to continually, usurp power and
Hmm.
emasculate and essentially, yeah, rob this patriarchal man of his power, of his rightful power, is kind of the frame. Uh, and so you can see that these kinds of, let's say the Amber Heard trial and things like that, these kind of victories for either side, they kind of played out right as this paradigm where it's win or loser, and that's the only
Hmm.
option, obviously. Um, but then I think about things like I recently saw the film Everything Everywhere All at Once. Have you seen
Mm.
that?
No, I saw the trailer that you posted though.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
Whoa. Yeah. Whoa. I mean, I highly recommend that. It's quite a it's amazing actually. It's one of the most interesting films I've seen in a long time.
Yeah.
Um, but there's a really, I guess I don't give too many spoilers. I'll just say one. There's a as a model of a, I would call it, well, actually, Rian Eisler, who sort of coined the dominator culture, right, paradigm versus partnership culture is actually
Mm.
what she uses, not necessarily patriarchy, but dominator and partnership. That film is a really beautiful example of one, a male role model who at first comes across as actually quite sort of weak-willed and kind of wishy-washy, and I mean the manosphere would definitely call him a beta male, right? Like in their language, it'd be like, oh, he's a total beta male.
I love the title,
But
automatic like stamp. This is who you
yeah,
are.
oh yeah,
It's
exactly, yeah,
endemic.
yeah. It's very aggressively judgmental, I would say.
Mm. Mm.
But I'll say in the film, again, even, they lead you to kind of have this sense of, oh yeah, he's sort of wet blanket kind of character, right? And I'll just say by the end of the film, he really is revealed to be occupying a very courageous stance in the face of that which would draw him into a dominator paradigm
Mm.
or like a victor win lose paradigm. That he's actually operating in a very kind of beautiful model of, well, really of kindness, actually, which is a big message in the film, which, again, I won't say too much more about it, but it
Mhm.
was really fascinating to watch. And again, I hear of Sophie offering those examples of, yeah, bringing more other models into like to reculture as
Mhm.
opposed to often what times, again, in a lose win scenario, that the blunt instrument of cancel culture,
Mhm.
right, it becomes that exactly that. And there's an Audre Lorde quote: "The master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house."
Mhm.
And so, yeah, again, the blunt instrument of win lose, applied by the ones who have previously been uh, below the victors. Let's say again, we're sort of re just redoing the very same paradigm. So
Yeah.
again, those nuances are really, they're tough to, yeah, to start, to just put in the columns or put in the box or whatever it is, but so necessary.
Yeah, and the problem, the challenge I see that we can't get to nuance unless we start to get curious, right? And the
Mm,
curiosity only comes when we have self reflection. And so, like big part of what informs my work as a journalist, as a storyteller, is like I'm also a mindfulness facilitator. I've been practicing for
mm,
15 years, and so this idea of to see the binary, like to step out of the binary and seeing it, it's like we take it for granted once you've done it, but like for people who are enmeshed in the culture, they don't see another potential, side to
yeah,
take, right? So like
yeah,
part of my work, my mission is to like, start to create spaces for people to feel themselves within a greater context, and that doesn't necessarily mean a creator or a philosophical context, but like experientially taking yourself out of a situation in your inner experience through a meditation practice, and that contemplative practice, it's almost like a precursor for you to see that internally is then seen externally. So we
mm,
can't hold a non-dual paradigm externally unless we can see that internally, and that's what the gifts of meditation has been for time immemorial, right? Like it's like, oh,
mm,
I can choose from my sense of agency about how to choose to this seemingly polarized do this do that phase. And so
mm,
I think that's a unique thing
mm,
that I feel that I want to offer to people too. It's like it might seem trite that we can even say like, think about things contradictingly and like the multifaceted, but that literally does not, from like a neuro diversity perspective, that doesn't make sense to a lot of people.
mm,
And
mm,
I find that in my own work as a journalist, a lot of times the questions that we ask ourselves generate a certain response. But if we don't
yeah,
think about the questions we're asking and why, we're always going to think that focus is the only way to look at something. Like, is the
Mm.
Amy Heard Johnny Depp thing, is it only a paradoxical two-dimensional thing? Or is there an avenue that we can look outside of it and say, like, what does this actually mean? Like, who are these individuals in their context? And what are the other factors that are pushing them in a direction? Was
Mm.
Johnny Depp abused? Was she abused? Like, all these other things that, like, that would actually give more meat and nuance to that conversation, that wouldn't just make the victor victim,
Mm.
combo.
Mm. Combo. Beautiful. Michael, well, yeah, real pleasure. We're getting to the end of our, laser focused crow's nest here. Yeah, I've really been appreciating our time and you listening as well. Again, if this is of interest to you at all, unpacking, seeing this way, highly invite you to come join us in the just opened School of Mythopoetics as of today. You can check it all out at schoolmythopoetics.com. And this is the kind of thing we do. Within there, we unpack it, we work with it. There's a lot of offerings that happen throughout the week, as well as invitations into mythology and story, and perhaps meditation coming to a session near you.
It's a gift. It's an offering. I absolutely would love to do it.
Awesome. Okay, well, Michael, thanks
Okay.
again.
Until
And
next time, gratitude for you and the work that you're doing and creating these spaces for us to have better dialogue and conversation around stuff. So thank you, Ian.
beautiful. To be continued.